Hi everyone, it's Phil Ellison here. I'm a triathlon coach at Total Tri Training. Just wanted to post a short video on some of the metrics that you can keep an eye out on your longer endurance sessions, or some of the key sessions as you build towards a middle distance or a full Ironman race. So what I'll do is I'll flick across to a PowerPoint that I've just put together briefly, just to show some metrics from a couple of rides that I was comparing at the weekend, which I think will give you a little insight into what to look for in the future. So I'll just flick to a screen share. Okay, so I think what is important to remember is that we're not always going to be raising our FTP or changing our heart rate data at the upper end. We can't constantly be striving for peak fitness all the time. And so we won't see new numbers that are glaringly obvious to us from an outright point of view. But when we're looking at some of our endurance sessions, which are obviously key to endurance performance in triathlon, we can look a little bit more in depth at the data and perhaps see some subtle changes over the weeks or indeed over the months as we build towards our goal races. So what I've done here is I've compared two sessions that I've done that are quite similar, both on the Turbo Trainer and looking just in depth at some of the data that we've got. And these are months and months apart, but very similar rides. So this might give you a little idea as to what you could look at if you're trying to see whether you're improving as far as endurance is concerned. And that's obviously of utmost importance for triathlon. So here's a ride which has been logged on Training Peaks. This is how it's presented if you're not familiar with Training Peaks. You can see the date in the top left corner. It was July of last year, so it's quite old now. This effort was one that I did in the garage as I was testing sweat rates and sodium losses, but it was a 5-hour ride, as you can see, just over 5 hours. And this is the data that I want to briefly go through, and then we'll compare it to a session that I did just this Saturday, which shows some nice trends in improved fitness. So the metrics really to look at is we've obviously got the 5-hour duration, which we've just said. Over on the left-hand side, we've got the graphical formation of the data. So here you can see that power is very steady, and that's because this is a ride that was set on erg mode. It was done so that we could keep it very strict, almost as scientific as possible. So the pink line doesn't alter apart from every hour. You can see there's quite a significant dropout in power, and that's where I got off the bike to reweigh myself and remove and reapply the sweat patches. So that's why there's a drop off there. You can see the heart rate, which is the red line, starts below the power line, but you can see it gradually increasing throughout the length and duration of the ride, and it finishes in the last hour, just above the power line. So that's something that we'll come on to in a little bit more detail in a minute, but there's the brief outline of what was going on during the 5 hours, and you can see the yellow is the cadence variations in that, and you can certainly see there's a lot more variation as we go through the ride. So again, looking at power to start with, in the purple bar chart, you can see as it was set on erg mode, it was pretty much all of the ride, solid zone 2 riding. And if we look over on the top right, you can see that as a percentage basically of my FTP, it was 0.69 as a ratio, or 69%. So that's a percentage of my FTP at that time, which was last July. And again, it was set at 0.7 to represent a typical sort of Ironman effort. And obviously I lost a little bit because of getting on and off the bike. If we look at what that meant as actual wattage, it was 247 normalized power. Again, the session was structured to be set at 250 watts. So it was very strategic from that point of view, with very little fluctuation. But again, that was because we were more looking at the sweat losses, and we wanted to make sure that effort didn't change throughout the course of the ride. We can tell that there was very little variation by this VI figure. VI is variability index. Anything that's very well paced, very even over the course of the ride will be less than 1.05. And again, you can't really get much less than using erg mode. It would have, if I'd have not jumped on and off the bike regularly, it would have been 1.00 because of the use of the erg mode. Moving over to heart rate, again, looking at the red bar chart now, we can see a little bit more variation. So the stress applied to the body in the form of power produces a strain within the body, and the heart rate shows the strain. And you can see here, probably that first hour, I was mostly in zone 1 heart rate, and then we've got a mix of zone 2 and probably finishing up in zone 3, as you would expect as heart rate drifts up. And that's kind of where we're going to look now for a little bit more from the data. If we look at the top right corner again, interestingly, efficiency factor is a very simple score of just dividing the power by the heart rate, and it's an average for the whole ride. So basically what we can say from that number of 1.74 is that for every heartbeat, I was generating 1.74 watts of power. So it's not useful during that ride, but when we compare it to another ride of a similar duration and similar intensity level, then it might be worthwhile knowing that number, because obviously an increase in that means we're generating more power for every heartbeat. Okay, so that's a number we're going to come back to in a second. And then finally, the decoupling number. So this is power versus heart rate, and it compares the first half of any effort or ride into the second. And what we can see here is there was a drift of 6%, very close to 6% drift. And that's what we saw with the red line over on the left-hand side. It starts quite low, but throughout the ride, it was rising and rising very slowly. It's said that ideally we need to be looking for less than 5%. So this wasn't a bad result. It was just slightly high. It was at a time of year when I hadn't done any really long rides. There were no Ironman races on the cards. So that perhaps just represents a slight lack of endurance at that point, but still 6% is very close to being very good. Okay, so that's the first ride. If we move on now to the second ride, again, it looks a little different, but this was just completing the PRL route on Zwift on Saturday. Similar, length of time at 5 hours and 8 minutes. As you can see, the graph over on the left-hand side looks a little bit different because this wasn't with erg mode on. This was just a free ride. It involved tackling Box Hill 11 times, at which I tried to, from 2 hours in, I tried to start to raise the effort going up Box Hill and recover a little on the downhill. So I started to freewheel for about 60 seconds or so every lap just to break it up a little bit. So you can see the pink line drops off quite significantly as I descend Box Hill, sort of from about 1 hour 40 into the ride. You can see here heart rate. There's an initial rise to match the power requirements and overcome that little bit of anaerobic demand that's generated right at the beginning of the ride. And then it stays fairly even until near the end when I was trying to push on a bit harder up Box Hill just to, pretty much get most of my energy out at that point. And again, cadence is variable as demanded by the course. If we look at power, again, it's not so structured here. We've got a little bit of zone 1. We've got a tiny bit of zone 4 power on the outer right-hand side. And we've still got the majority in zone 2, which is as you'd expect. We've got quite a lot more, however, in zone 3. So there's a lot more variability in this ride, generally speaking. If we look at the IF again, this is the intensity factor or the percentage against my FTP. My FTP is about 5 to 10 watts lower at this point compared to last year. But as you can see, the overall normalized power was 255. So I was about 8 watts higher for the overall average ride this time. It's coming up as a higher intensity factor because that's also matching against an FTP that's probably 10 watts or so lower. So I was riding at 74% this time. And then again, looking at that variability index, although we've got that 1 minute of reduced effort coming down Box Hill, and we've got probably an increase in effort going up Box Hill each time on every lap, which is about once every 25 to 30 minutes. It still doesn't change the variability massively. Obviously, the last one was 1.02. And here, because I'm still controlling the effort, although I'm varying it, it's still really quite well controlled at 1.03. And then looking at heart rate, again mimicking the power really, we've got a bit more variability. We've got quite a lot more in zone 3 heart rate, and we've even got some zone 4 heart rates as well. So more variability in general. However, when we look at the two figures that I wanted to concentrate on a little bit more, and I've just flagged up the results from the last one on the right-hand side, as we just mentioned, the efficiency factor has gone up from 1.74 to 1.81. Whether that's particularly significant, I don't really know, but it's a step in the right direction, and it means that we've got a slight trend for improved efficiency, generating more power for slightly lower heart rate. And then probably more significantly is we've got this power to heart rate, which is the decoupling. And again, it's measuring the first half of the ride and the average heart rate versus the second half of the ride and the average power and heart rate. And we can see quite a large trend for improved endurance here. So aerobic efficiency and aerobic endurance has probably improved quite a lot since July of last year. And now it's only a 1.3% decoupling, which is negligible and is excellent really for that length of ride, which is obviously mimicking my typical sort of Ironman effort. So all in all, the trends there are very positive. It's comparing two like-for-like bike rides, or as close as you can get really. Obviously, they wouldn't normally be spaced apart by around about 9 months, but this is just merely using some data to explain the point. If you utilize this on a similar bike ride about 6 to 8 weeks apart, then it's probably going to be very useful for you to compare these metrics, which lie just under the radar generally. So it's worth keeping an eye on some of these things that don't scream out at you as improved fitness, but they can be seen if you look for them. There were some slight differences in this. So I'm going to take this as a positive step, but back in July, the weather was very hot in the garage. It was about 19, 20 degrees, I think. And then when I repeated it this week, it was about 9 or 10 degrees. So that 10-degree swing in temperature could definitely make a difference as far as heart rate is concerned. And unfortunately, over the duration of the ride, my internal bodily temperature may have gone up quite a lot more on the first ride. I think hydration and nutrition were very similar, so I don't expect that they will have caused any differences in the results. And again, we've got this slight difference in the way that the course was ridden, with erg mode for the first one, which doesn't allow any variation in power, no let-ups at all, whereas the second ride is riding a bit more to feel, with some recovery intervals, although they were only short. So again, there are some differences, but definitely good to see these positive trends. And then just by way as a summary, we need to look beyond some of the simplistic figures that we perhaps always look at, particularly where endurance performance is concerned. So it's good to look under the curve, under your FTP. Don't always be looking for bigger numbers. We can see signs of improvement, and they're often crucial, but they're underneath that curve really. We can't always be raising your FTP or your VO2 max right throughout the year. And indeed, although FTP is probably the most important metric that we have to indicate what somebody's performance will be like, it's important that we don't focus wholly on that if we're going, particularly building for longer than Olympic distance racing. And ideally what you'd use this for is your typical long endurance sessions, either just, your typical weekend rides of 2 to 3 hours in zone 2. That could show signs of improvement, as I've just said, or when you get into your race specific block, when you trying to hit your goal race power, if it's Ironman at 70 or 75% of FTP, and you're holding it for 3, 4, even 5 hours at the weekend, that's a great one to try to compare to previous performance. Or again, similarly for 70.3 distance, if you're trying to do 2 to 3 hours up at 80, 85% of FTP, then that would be a good one to compare. So the measures that you really want to be looking at for these sorts of endurance efforts are your decoupling figures, which is the power to heart rate ratio, your efficiency factor, which is EF on the Training Peaks dashboard, and also not forgetting your perceived effort. So if you ride an endurance effort one month and it feels like an 8 out of 10 at the end, whereas the next month you only build to about a 7 out of 10 and yet heart rate and power were similar, then that's probably a good sign as well, because internally you're feeling that effort was a little easier. So a few things to think about. Hope that was of use, and good luck with your training and build towards the hopeful reintroduction of racing this summer.